A millionaire was tormented by the silence of his twin daughters, whose enchanting beauty hid a dark mystery. But when the maid revealed a medical secret, everything he knew about life and love was turned upside down. If you enjoy emotional stories, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're listening from. Continuing. In the opulent quietude of Belgravia, London, stood an imposing mansion that seemed to defy the reality around it. It was a modern construction, all straight lines and mirrored glass, the kind that graces the pages of architecture magazines and makes passers-by slow their pace to admire. High walls protected an immaculate garden, where every leaf seemed to have been positioned by a designer. There was an almost surreal silence on that property, a kind of quietude that didn't fit a city that never sleeps, that roars and shouts and pulses 24 hours a day. But inside, behind those white walls and automatic gates, time seemed to have stopped exactly 5 years ago. That mansion belonged to Edward Norton, one of the most powerful men in the British financial market. At 43, Edward was the kind of person whose name made the hearts of entrepreneurs either accelerate or stop, depending on the context. He commanded one of the country's largest investment funds, moving billions with the same ease with which other men move domino pieces. His intelligence was razor-sharp, his strategic vision almost supernatural, and his ability to maintain composure amidst chaos had become legendary in the market. People said that Edward Norton had no heart, that he had pound signs running through his veins, that he was a machine disguised as a human. But it wasn't always like that. There was a time when Edward smiled, when his eyes shone with something beyond numbers and graphs. There was a time when that mansion vibrated with life, with laughter, with music. But that time died on a rainy March night 5 years ago, and never returned. In the center of that silent house on the second floor, in a spacious room decorated with a refined taste that bordered on exaggeration, lived Edward's twin daughters, Isabella and Gabrielle, 2 5-year-old girls who seemed to have been painted by a melancholic artist, with features too delicate for this world. They had fair and translucent skin, like antique porcelain, brown hair that fell in soft waves over their shoulders, and deep brown eyes that seemed to guard ancient secrets. They were beautiful in a way that made your heart ache, the kind of children who make people turn their heads in the street and sigh. But there was something disturbing about that beauty. Isabella and Gabrielle didn't walk. They didn't run through the garden, didn't climb stairs, didn't explore the corners of the gigantic house where they lived. They stayed there, sitting side by side on a grey velvet sofa, as motionless as 2 porcelain dolls in an expensive shop window. Around them, scattered throughout the room, were toys that had never been touched, imported dolls still in their boxes, building blocks that had never been assembled, stuffed animals that had never been hugged. Everything immaculate, everything perfect, everything dead from neglect. And more distressing than that, they didn't speak. Not a word, not a sound, not a whimper. 5 years of absolute life in silence. They didn't say daddy, they didn't ask for food, they didn't cry when they felt pain. The silence of those 2 children was so heavy, it seemed to suck the air from the room, transforming the luxurious bedroom into a mausoleum for the living. They didn't cry, didn't laugh, didn't react to anything. They sat there day after day, their eyes fixed on some invisible point in space, as if they were trapped in a parallel dimension, seeing things no one else could see. The tragedy had begun the night they were born. Marianne, Edward's wife, had been the love of his life. They met in university. She studied fine arts while he studied economics. Marianne was everything Edward wasn't, free, spontaneous, full of color and life. She painted enormous canvases full of vibrant colors, laughed too loudly in fancy restaurants, danced barefoot in the rain. Edward fell madly in love with that woman, who seemed to have been made of pure light. When Marianne became pregnant with the twins, Edward felt that life finally made sense. He, who had always been pragmatic, rational, cold, suddenly found himself crying watching baby videos on YouTube, decorating the girls' room with his own hands, talking to them through Marianne's belly every night before bed. For the first time in his life, Edward Norton had learned what unconditional love was. But the universe sometimes is cruel for no apparent reason. Marianne's pregnancy was complicated from the start. She had high blood pressure, gestational diabetes, a series of complications that made the doctors frown and whisper amongst themselves. But Marianne was stubborn. She said everything would be fine, that her daughters were strong, that love would overcome any obstacle. Edward wanted to believe. God, how he wanted to believe. The delivery was scheduled for a Thursday in March. Edward remembered every detail of that day as if it had happened yesterday. He remembered the smell of disinfectant from the Portland hospital, the sound of his shoes on the marble floor, Marianne's cold hand squeezing his in the elevator. He remembered her smiling, even through fear, saying, "Everything will be all right, my love, I know it will." He remembered believing her. Complications began during the C-section. Marianne's blood pressure skyrocketed. The baby's hearts dangerously slowed. What should have been a routine procedure turned into a nightmare of shouts, alarms, doctors rushing. Edward was expelled from the operating room, stood outside with shaky legs, praying to a God he barely believed in. When the door finally opened, they had 3 pieces of news to give. The twins had been born. Small, fragile, but alive. Isabella weighed 5.5 pounds. Gabriel just 5 pounds. They went straight to the neonatal intensive care unit. Edward didn't even have time to process the news when the final blow came. Marianne had suffered cardiac arrest. The doctors tried to resuscitate her, did everything they could, but her heart, that enormous heart that had loved Edward with frightening intensity, simply stopped beating. Edward didn't remember much of what happened next. He remembered screaming, punching the wall until his fingers bled, falling to his knees in the middle of the corridor while nurses tried to lift him. He remembered looking at the 2 incubators where his daughters slept, connected to tubes and monitors, and feeling something die inside him. Marianne had died bringing those children into the world. How could he look at them without remembering that? How could he love them knowing they had cost her life? In the first few months, Edward functioned on autopilot. He hired the best nannies, the best doctors, the best therapists. He gave his daughters everything good and best, except the only thing that truly mattered, presence. He couldn't be near them. Every time he looked at Isabella and Gabriel, he saw Marianne's face. He saw those brown eyes that were exactly like hers. He saw the shape of her mouth, the way her nose curved. It was as if Marianne was there, multiplied by 2, reminding Edward every day of what he had lost. So Edward did what he knew how to do. He worked. He worked like a man possessed. 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. He buried his pain in spreadsheets, in meetings, in negotiations. He transformed grief into gain, longing into strategy. His company grew exponentially. He became even richer, even more powerful, even colder. People commented that Edward Norton had become a machine after his wife died. They didn't know it was the only way for him to survive. Meanwhile, Isabella and Gabriel grew up in the silent house, surrounded by professional care but empty of true affection. The nannies followed strict routines, the doctors performed endless exams, the therapists applied sophisticated techniques. But as the months passed and turned into years, it became increasingly obvious that something was profoundly wrong with those girls. They didn't meet any developmental milestones. At 1 year old, they should have been crawling, babbling, interacting. But they remained inert. At 2 years old, they should have been walking, speaking simple words. Nothing. At 3, 4, 5 years old, the situation only worsened. It was as if Isabella and Gabriel had decided not to participate in this world, as if they were trapped somewhere between life and death, existing but not living. Medical diagnoses accumulated like cards from a cursed deck. Global developmental delay, possible cerebral palsy, severe autism, sensory processing disorder. The most renowned specialists in London, in the UK, even from abroad, were consulted. They performed MRIs, CT scans, genetic tests, neurological tests. Fortunes were spent on experimental treatments, alternative therapies, revolutionary methods. Nothing worked. The final diagnosis, given by the most respected doctor in the field, was devastating. Irreversible global delay, with a grim prognosis and minimal possibility of significant improvement. In the technical cold language of medicine, that meant a sentence. Isabella and Gabriel would probably spend the rest of their lives like this. Trapped in their own bodies, unable to live fully, eternally dependent on the care of others. Edward received the news alone in his office late at night after a video conference with the neurologist. He turned off the computer, poured a glass of whiskey, and looked at Marianne's photo that he still kept in his drawer. It was the only thing of hers he had managed to preserve in the house. In the portrait, she smiled that way she did, with sparkling eyes radiant with happiness. It had been taken on their honeymoon, on a beach on the Amalfi Coast with the blue sea in the background. "I'm sorry," Edward whispered to the photo. His voice choked. "I tried. I swear I tried. But I don't know how to save our daughters. I don't know how to be the father they need. I don't know how to live without you." The only answer was the heavy silence of the empty mansion. Edward drank the whiskey in one gulp, locked the photo back in the drawer, and returned to work. It was always to work that he returned. It was the only place where things still made sense. It was in this frozen scenario, in this house that was more mausoleum than home, that everything began to change because of a seemingly trivial circumstance. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Lords, a 60-year-old woman who commanded the staff with an iron fist, had to dismiss one of the cleaners. The young woman had stolen some small objects from the house, silly things. Trinkets of no real value, but theft was theft, and Mrs. Lords did not tolerate dishonesty. They needed an urgent replacement. And that's how Rosemarie entered the story. Rose was 38, a simple woman from rural the Cotswolds who had come to London seeking a better life like so many others. She had only studied until the 4th grade. Her hands were calloused from hard work, and she carried on her body the signs of a tough life. But she had a sweetness in her eyes that was rare to see, a kind of genuine goodness not learned from books, that comes from within. On Rose's first day at the mansion, Mrs. Lords made the rules clear: punctuality, discretion, efficiency. And most importantly, not to get involved with family matters. "You're here to clean, not to offer opinions," the housekeeper said with that dry tone that left no room for discussion. Rose merely nodded, accustomed to this kind of treatment. It wasn't the first rich house she had worked in, and she knew her place. When Rose first entered the twins' room to clean, something happened inside her. She saw those 2 little girls sitting on the sofa, motionless with those empty eyes, and felt such a strong ache in her chest she could barely breathe. It wasn't pity. It wasn't textbook compassion. It was something else, something deeper, a visceral recognition. Rose had lost a daughter at 2 years old, a long time ago, to meningitis. The pain of that loss had never completely passed. She had only learned to live with it, as one learns to live with a scar that aches when the weather changes. Looking at Isabella and Gabrielle, Rose saw something no one else had seen. She didn't see patients, didn't see lost causes, didn't see medical diagnoses. She saw sadness. She saw loneliness. She saw 2 little children screaming inside that no one could hear. And she felt, deep in her soul, that maybe she could do something. She didn't know what. She had no training, no technique, no scientific knowledge. She had only an ancient intuition, the kind rural women carry as an inheritance from their grandmothers and great-grandmothers, passed down through generations like a cake recipe or a prayer against the evil eye. So Rose began to do what she knew how to do: care. As she cleaned the room, she began to hum softly. They were old country songs, nursery rhymes, ditties her mother used to sing when she was a child back in the countryside, among cornstalks and chickens scratching in the yard. Rose's voice was simple, even a little off-key, but it carried something that all the scientific methods in the world didn't: true affection, emotional memory, human warmth. And it was while humming one of those silly songs, something about a little butterfly that was in the kitchen, that Rose felt a shiver run up her spine. She looked at the girls and noticed that one of them, Isabella, had moved her eyes in her direction. It was a minimal movement, almost imperceptible, but Rose was sure of what she had seen. Her heart pounded. She continued singing, now even softer, almost whispering, and saw Isabella turn her little head slightly, seeking the source of that sound. At that exact moment, on the other side of the city, in his office in the most modern corporate building in Canary Wharf, Edward Norton was looking at the house's security cameras. He had installed that system months ago, not exactly for security reasons, but because it was the only way he could connect with his daughters. He couldn't bear to be physically near them, but he compulsively monitored the screens, checking if they were well, if the nannies were taking proper care, if they needed anything. It was pathetic, he knew. A father who could only see his daughters through screens. But it was the most he could do without falling apart. That day, Edward saw the scene that would change everything. He saw the new employee humming as she cleaned. He saw Isabella react. He felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years, a strange mix of fear and hope that made him dizzy. He stood there paralyzed, looking at the computer screen, watching that simple woman do in 5 minutes what battalions of specialists hadn't been able to do in 5 years, reach his daughters. He didn't intervene. He didn't call the house, didn't message the housekeeper, didn't do anything. He just kept watching, his heart beating erratically, feeling something begin to crack in the ice wall he had built around his own heart. And for the first time in 5 long and painful years, Edward Norton allowed himself to feel a tiny, almost microscopic, but real spark of something he was sure he would never feel again in his life: hope. Rose continued to come every day. She arrived punctually at 7 in the morning, greeted Mrs. Lords with a discreet good morning, put on her light blue uniform, and began her routine. She cleaned the bathrooms, mopped the marble floors, organized the impeccable rooms that were already impeccable. But the moment she most anticipated, the one that made her heart beat faster, was when it was time to clean the twins' room. She had created her own routine. She entered slowly, as if entering a church with respect and delicacy. First, she opened the windows a little, letting the fresh morning air in. Then she started tidying, but always humming softly. Country songs, the ones her grandmother sang while washing clothes in the river, that her mother hummed while preparing lunch on the wood-fired stove. Simple songs with silly words about frogs, butterflies, little birds. But there was something in those old melodies, something that touched a place that science couldn't reach, and the girls reacted. Gradually, but they reacted. Isabella was the first. After that initial time when she moved her eyes, she began to follow Rose around the room with her gaze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but Rose was. Rose saw every minimal movement, every small change, like a mother sees her child's first smile. Gabrielle took a little longer, but eventually also began to show signs. One day, when Rose sang a song about a little lamb, Gabrielle slightly moved her fingers. Mrs. Lords didn't look favorably on the situation. "You're here to clean, not to put on a little show for the girls," she grumbled whenever she caught Rose singing. "The therapists take care of that. You have no training. You don't know what you're doing. You could even hinder their treatment." Rose merely lowered her head and apologized, but deep down she knew she wasn't hindering anything. She was helping. She felt it in her gut, with a certainty that didn't need a diploma to validate. But Mrs. Lords had power in the house, and Rose was afraid of losing that job. She needed the money. She sent half her salary to her sick mother in the Cotswolds, paid the rent for the tiny room she rented in East London. She couldn't afford to be fired. The tension increased when Mrs. Lords called a meeting with the girls' medical team. There was Dr. Patricia, the chief neurologist, a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back in a tight bun, always wearing expensive tailored suits and carrying a leather briefcase. There was also Sandra, the physiotherapist, and Julia, the occupational therapist, all competent women with impressive resumes, years of study and experience. "We need to talk about the new employee," Mrs. Lords began, with the tone of someone reporting a crime. "She keeps singing to the girls, talking to them, moving things in the room. It's not professional. It might be interfering with your treatment." Dr. Patricia frowned. "Singing? What kind of singing?" "I don't know, silly children's songs." "Those country things," the doctor sighed. "We need to maintain protocol. The girls have a structured routine based on scientific evidence. We cannot have random variables interfering with the process." But it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Julia, the occupational therapist, who was normally quiet and only agreed with what the others said, spoke up. "Wait, let me see if I understand. The cleaner sings to them and they react." "It's not really a reaction," Mrs. Lords tried to minimize. I don't know, Rose says they move their eyes, things like that." "And have you seen this happen?" Julia asked, now more interested. "I don't stand around watching the cleaner do her job," Mrs. Lords replied, irritated. Julia looked at Dr. Patricia. "I think we should observe before prohibiting anything. If there is any response, even minimal, we need to understand what is generating it." Dr. Patricia didn't like the idea. She had invested years of her career developing rigid protocols, tested methods, scientific approaches. The idea that an untrained cleaner could achieve something she hadn't was at the very least unsettling. But Julia had a point. They were professionals, and professionals don't ignore data just because they don't like it. "All right," the doctor finally agreed. "We'll observe. But if there's any indication that this is hindering progress, the employee returns to her normal duties, and that's final. Meanwhile, from his office overlooking Fifth Avenue, Edward continued to watch the cameras religiously. It had become an obsession. He would leave meetings midway, cancel appointments, just to see those minutes when Rose was in his daughter's room. And the more he watched, the more certain he became that something extraordinary was happening. He saw Isabella smile. It was a shy, almost invisible smile, but it was a smile. He saw Gabriella nod her head when Rose sang. He saw both of them looking at the woman with an attention he had never witnessed before. They were small things, crumbs of reaction, but for Edward, who had spent 5 years seeing his daughters completely absent, it was miraculous. He wanted to go there, wanted to meet that woman, wanted to thank her, but he couldn't. The barrier he had built around himself was too thick. He was afraid that if he went home, if he truly looked at his daughters, if he allowed himself to feel again, the pain would return with such force, it would kill him. It was easier, safer to watch through the screen, to keep his distance, to continue living on the cold surface where nothing hurt because nothing was real. But Edward made a decision. Without telling anyone, without consulting the medical team, he picked up the phone and called Mrs. Lords. "Hello?" "Mrs. Lords, it's Edward Novaes." The housekeeper tensed immediately. Her employer never called. He sent emails, messages, but never called. "Yes, Dr. Edward, is there a problem?" "The new cleaner." "Rose, is that her name?" Mrs. Lords's heart pounded. She was sure he was going to complain, going to fire the woman for doing things outside of protocol. "Yes, sir. If she did something wrong, I can—" "She didn't do anything wrong," Edward cut her off. "I want her to spend more time with the girls." Silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, sir?" "I want her to be responsible for staying with Isabella and Gabriella for a few hours a day. In addition to her normal cleaning. I'll increase her salary, obviously. But Dr. Edward, she has no training. The medical team— I'm not asking for your opinion, Mrs. Lords. I'm giving an order. Make it happen." And he hung up. Mrs. Lords stood there, staring at the phone, completely lost. This was going to cause problems, she knew. Dr. Patricia was going to have a fit. But orders were orders, and Edward Novaes paid the bills. When Rose heard the news, she didn't know whether to be happy or scared. "But Mrs. Lords, I don't know how to care for children with special needs. I haven't studied this." "Indeed, I think it's crazy too," the housekeeper agreed. "But the master wants it this way. You'll spend 4 hours a day with the girls. In the morning, after cleaning, you can do what you've been doing. Sing, talk, whatever. Just don't mess anything up, because if anything happens to these children, the problem will be yours and mine." Rose swallowed hard. It was an enormous responsibility, but she felt she had to accept. Those girls needed her, in a way she couldn't explain. They needed the kind of care that didn't come in a manual, that wasn't learned at university. They needed something older, truer. "All right," she finally said. "I accept." The next day, Rose began her new routine. She would finish cleaning and then stay in the room with the twins. At first, she wasn't quite sure what to do. She sat on the floor because it felt wrong to sit on the fine sofa next to them, and started to talk. She spoke about her life, her childhood in the countryside, her mother, the daughter she had lost. She spoke about the chickens she raised when she was little, the smell of rain on the red earth, the taste of guava picked fresh from the tree. The girls listened to her. Rose was sure of it. Even without speaking, even without moving much, they were there, present in a way they hadn't been before. It was as if her voice was opening paths in dark places, lighting up small lights in rooms that had been closed for a long time. One day, Rose had an idea. She brought a bag from home with simple things: dried leaves from the garden, small pebbles, feathers she had found in the park. She took Isabella's tiny hands and placed a leaf in her palm. "Feel this, my love." "It's a leaf. It comes from the tree. The tree gives shade, gives fruit, gives life. Feel how dry it is." And for the first time, Isabella closed her tiny fingers around the leaf. It was a slow, trembling movement, but it was a voluntary movement. Rose had to hold back her tears. She couldn't cry in front of the girls. She had to be strong to be the light they needed. She did the same with Gabriella, this time with a soft feather. "Look how light it is, my little one. Light like a good dream, light like a cloud in the sky. Gabriella didn't close her hand, but Rose saw her eyes become moist for the first time. A small tear trickled down her porcelain face. Gabriella was crying. She was feeling. She was alive in a way she hadn't been before. From that day on, Rose brought something different every day. Flowers for them to smell, wet earth for them to touch, soft cotton for them to feel, warm water in a bowl for them to dip their hands in. Each small sensory experience was a bridge between the world and those girls who had disconnected from it. And little by little, slowly but undeniably, Isabella and Gabriella began to awaken. They started making sounds, not words yet but sounds, babbling, moans, attempts at communication. They began to move their bodies more. Isabella managed to sit up alone without support. Gabriella lifted her arm to touch Rose's face. The medical team observed everything with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Julia, the occupational therapist, was the only one who was openly excited. "This is incredible," she would say. "It's basic sensory stimulation, but applied with so much affection, such genuine connection. It's as if she's healing their souls, not just their bodies." Dr. Patricia didn't like words like soul and healing. It was too esoteric, too unscientific. But she couldn't deny the results. She asked to review all of the girls' previous exams, all the diagnoses, looking for something that might have gone unnoticed. Edward continued to watch everything from afar. He saw his daughters gain life day after day, like flowers finally receiving water after a long drought, and each small victory of the girls was a stab in his chest. Because it meant he had failed. It meant that what they needed was there all along, available, simple, but he had been unable to provide it. He had been too cowardly to stay close, to risk feeling again. Jealousy also began to gnaw at him from within. That woman, that stranger, was achieving what he couldn't. She was saving his daughters. She was occupying the place that should have been his. The girls looked at her with love, sought her touch, smiled at her. And for him, for their own father, nothing, because he had never been there. He had never sung to them, never held their hands, never offered anything but money and distance. One night, alone in his office, Edward finally had the courage to do something he had avoided for 5 years. He opened the drawer where he kept Mariana's things. Photos, letters, a scarf that still held her perfume. He picked up the diary she had started writing during her pregnancy. Page after page of dreams, plans, love. He read until he reached the last entry, written 3 days before the birth. "Love of my life, Edward, I know you'll read this one day. If something happens to me, promise me one thing. Promise you'll love our girls with all the strength you have. Promise you won't let the pain keep you away from them. They will need you. Not your money, not your intelligence, you, your heart, your embrace. Your off-key songs. Promise me, my love, for me." Edward closed the diary and broke down. He cried for the first time since Mariana's funeral. He cried for everything he had lost, for everything he had wasted, for everything he could still lose if he didn't have the courage to change. He cried until he had no more tears, until he was empty, until he finally had space within himself to feel something other than pain. And in that moment, on that cold night in New York City, with the city pulsing below and the stars hidden by pollution, Edward Novaes made the most difficult decision of his life. He was going home. He was going to meet that woman. He was finally going to try to be a real father to the daughters he had emotionally abandoned. He didn't know if it was too late. He didn't know if he could do it. But he had to try. He owed it to Mariana. He owed it to Isabella and Gabriella. And he owed it to himself. It was a Thursday morning when Edward finally mustered the courage. He had rehearsed that moment 1,000 times in his head, but now that it was actually happening, his legs felt like jelly, his heart pounded, his hands were sweating. He drove slowly through Kensington Gardens, seeing the familiar streets as if for the first time. Everything seemed different now, sharper, more real. When the automatic gate opened, Edward took a deep breath. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. He knew Rose was inside with the girls. He had planned to arrive at this time precisely for that reason. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He didn't want them to change their routine. He didn't want a performance. He wanted to see how it really was. He parked the black Mercedes in the garage and entered through the main door. The house was silent as always, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer that dead, heavy, suffocating silence. There was something of life in it now, a promise of sound, of movement. Mrs. Lords almost dropped her coffee cup when she saw him. "Dr. Edward? I didn't know you were—" "Coming today!" "I didn't announce it," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where are the girls?" "In their room with Rose, but—" Edward didn't wait for her to finish. He went up the stairs, each step feeling like a mountain. How long had it been since he'd climbed those stairs? Months? Almost a year? He had lost count. He always sent the medical team upstairs, always watched via the cameras, but he himself avoided that floor as if it were radioactive. When he got close to the bedroom door, he heard something that made his heart stop. Laughter. Childlike laughter, high-pitched, pure. He froze with his hand on the doorframe, not daring to enter. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and finally pushed the door open. The scene he saw completely disarmed him. Rose was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, with a colourful cloth book in her hands. Isabella was beside her, no longer inert on the sofa, but sitting on the rug, propped up with cushions. And Gabriella was trying to crawl towards a colourful ball that Rose had rolled. It was an uncoordinated, difficult movement, but it was movement. It was life. Rose looked up and was startled to see the man standing in the doorway. She knew that face from the photos scattered around the house. It was her employer, the girl's father. She quickly stood up, smoothing her uniform. "Dr. Edward, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were—" "No," he interrupted her, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "You don't need to apologize. Please continue what you were doing." Rose hesitated, unsure what to do. The man looked fragile. It wasn't the word she would expect to use to describe a billionaire, but it was the only one that came to mind. His eyes were red, his clothes wrinkled, and he had an expression of someone about to fall apart. I was telling them a story," Rose explained, her voice low, "about little birds learning to fly." Edward nodded, unable to speak. His eyes were fixed on his daughters. Isabella had looked at him when he entered, but her face showed no recognition. It was as if he were a stranger, and that's what he was, he realized with a searing pain. A stranger in his own daughters' lives. May I stay and watch?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Rose looked at the girls as if asking their permission, and then nodded. "Of course, Doctor. Make yourself at home." Edward sat in a distant armchair, trying not to draw attention, and Rose returned to the floor with the girls. She resumed the story where she had left off, her soft voice filling the room. Then the mommy bird said to her little ones, "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'll hold you. You can open your little wings and I won't let you fall." Rose spread her arms, imitating wings, and to Edward's astonishment, Isabella mimicked the gesture. She lifted her tiny arms, trembling with effort, making a flapping motion, and she smiled. His daughter smiled. Edward had to cover his mouth with his hand to keep from making a sound. Tears streamed down his face without permission. He was witnessing a miracle unfold before him. He was seeing his daughters, whom doctors had declared lost causes, responding, interacting, living. Rose continued the story, now using different voices for each character. A tiny voice for the baby birds, a deeper voice for the daddy bird, a sweet voice for the mommy bird. It was simple, unsophisticated theater, but it worked. The girls were completely engrossed, their little eyes shining in a way Edward had never seen. When the story ended, Rose picked up the colorful ball and showed it to Gabriella. "Look here, my love. Do you want to take the ball? Come on, you can do it." Gabriella looked at the ball, then at Rose, then back at the ball. And then, with visible effort, she began to drag herself towards the object. It was painful to watch, but it was beautiful too. Every inch gained was an epic victory. "That's it, my darling. You can do it. Come on, come on," Rose encouraged, her voice full of genuine emotion. Gabriella finally reached the ball and grasped it with both hands. She looked at Rose with an expression of triumph, and Rose clapped. "Congratulations, my little bird. You did it. See how strong you are?" It was at that moment that Edward could no longer remain silent. She had never done that before, he said, his voice choked. Rose turned to him, and for the first time truly looked into the eyes of that man. She saw in them the same pain she saw in his daughter's eyes. All wounded, all trapped, all needing healing. "She can do a lot, Doctor," Rose replied softly. "Both of them can. They just need someone who believes in them, who has patience, who doesn't give up." The words fell upon Edward like stones. He had given up. Since the first bad diagnosis, he had given up on his daughters. He had accepted the medical prognosis as absolute truth and had distanced himself so as not to have to deal with the disappointment, with the pain of seeing what they would never be. "How do you do it?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The doctors tried everything. Therapies, medications, special methods. Nothing worked." "And you sing to them and they respond. How?" Rose thought for a moment before answering. She wasn't good with fancy words, with complicated explanations. But she knew what she felt and she decided to speak from the heart. "You know, doctor, I lost a daughter when she was 2 years old. Meningitis. It was very quick. One day she was playing, the next she was gone." Rose paused, her voice trembling slightly. "After she died, I was lost. I couldn't understand why God had taken my little girl. I was angry, sad, with a hole in my chest that felt like it would never close." Edward listened in silence, recognizing every feeling described. "But then, with time, I understood something. The pain doesn't go away. We just learn to carry it in a different way. And we learn that love doesn't die when a person dies. Love stays, and if we keep that love only to ourselves, it rots, turns into poison. But if we share that love, if we give it to other people, to other children who need it, then love stays alive." It continues to make sense. Rose looked at the girls, then back at Edward. "I look at Isabella and Gabriella, and I see 2 little children who are hungry for love. Not hunger for food, not lack of medicine. Hunger for real affection. Hunger for presence. Hunger for someone to look at them and see people, not disease." The truth of those simple words hit Edward like a punch. He had looked at his daughters and seen only the diagnosis, seen what they weren't, what they couldn't do, what they would never be. He had never truly seen them as people, as his daughters. As the girls Mariana had dreamed of bringing into the world. "I failed them," Edward said, the words coming out painfully. "I am their father and I failed completely." Rose shook her head. "You didn't fail, doctor. You are suffering. It's different. Pain also makes us sick, also paralyzes us. You were frozen in pain and they were frozen with you. But no one has to stay frozen forever. Everyone can thaw with help. And you are helping them thaw. I'm trying. But do you know who they really need? Not me. They need their father." Edward looked at his daughters, who were now distracted with other toys Rose had scattered. Isabella was trying to fit colorful blocks together, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Gabriella held a small cloth doll, pressing it against her chest. "They don't even know me," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm a stranger to them. Then stay for a while. Get to know them. Let them get to know you." Rose stood up, wiping her hands on her uniform. "I'll go downstairs and make some coffee. You stay here with them, just stay. You don't need to do anything special. You just need to be here." "But I don't know what to do. I don't know how." "Nobody is born knowing how to be a father, doctor. We learn by doing, by making mistakes, by trying again." Rose placed a hand on his shoulder, a bold gesture for an employee to touch her employer, but natural in that moment. "Start slowly. Sit near them. Let them look at you. Talk to them. Sing something, even if it's off-key. They don't care about the tuning. They just want to feel that you are there." And with that, Rose left the room, leaving Edward alone with his daughters for the first time in years. The silence returned, but it was no longer frightening. It was full of possibilities. Edward took a deep breath and got out of the armchair. He sat on the floor a few feet from the girls. He stayed there doing nothing, just observing. Isabella eventually looked at him. She studied his face with those deep eyes. Edward smiled, a trembling and uncertain smile. "Hi," he said softly. I'm your father." Isabella continued to look without a clear expression. "I know I haven't been here. I know I should have been. I'm so sorry." Tears began to fall again, but Edward didn't try to hide them. "Your mother, Mariana, she loved you so much. She loved both of you more than she loved her own life. Literally. And she would have been an incredible mother. She would have sung to you. She would have played with you. She would have taught you how to paint because she was a painter. You know, she made beautiful paintings full of color. Gabriella had stopped playing and was also looking at him now, and I was so angry I lost her, in so much pain, that I ended up losing you both too. But I don't want to lose anymore. I don't want to waste any more time. I want to try to be a real father. If you'll let me, if it's not too late." There was a moment of silence, and then Isabella did something extraordinary. She crawled slowly, painfully towards Edward. She stopped to rest, then continued. It was a journey of only 2 meters, but it seemed to last an eternity. Edward stood paralyzed, barely daring to breathe. When Isabella finally reached him, she looked up and raised her tiny arms. A universal gesture, a request to be picked up. Edward felt the world stop. With trembling hands, he picked up his daughter for the first time in years. She was so small, so light, so fragile. She smelled of baby shampoo and something else, something indefinable that was uniquely hers. Isabella rested her head on Edward's chest, right where his heart beat erratically. And she stayed there, quiet, simply existing in her father's arms. Gabrielle, seeing her sister, also began to crawl towards them. Edward extended his other arm and pulled her close as well, and there, sitting on the floor of the luxurious room, with his 2 daughters in his lap, Edward Novaeus finally allowed himself to feel everything he had repressed for 5 long and devastating years. He felt the impossible love he had for the girls, the grief for his lost wife, the regret for the wasted years, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to fix things. He began to hum softly. He didn't know any children's songs, so he sang the only thing that came to mind. A song Marianne loved, an old Tom Jobim tune about spring and flowers. He sang off-key, forgetting the lyrics midway, but he kept singing, and the girls in his arms remained quiet, just listening, just feeling that finally, after so long in darkness and cold, the sun was starting to rise again. After that day, everything changed. Edward began to cancel meetings, delegate responsibilities, and do something he had never done in his life as a businessman: set boundaries at work. He started coming home in the middle of the afternoon, went straight to the girls' room, sat on the floor next to Rose and learned. He learned to play, to make funny voices, to be patient when things didn't work out the first time. At first it was clumsy, almost comical. Rose had to hold back laughter when she saw that powerful man, always so serious and controlled, trying to imitate a duck going quack quack or building a crooked tower of colorful blocks. But Edward didn't care about looking ridiculous. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about performance, about appearing competent. He just wanted to be there, present, trying. And the girls responded. Slowly, but they responded. Isabella began to emit more complex sounds, attempts at words. Pa, 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 she babbled, looking at Edward. It wasn't exactly daddy yet, but it was a promise. Gabrielle began to bear her own body weight with more strength, to sit unsupported for longer periods, until one day she managed to stand holding onto a chair. Edward documented everything. No longer through cold security cameras, but with his phone, recording shaky and emotional videos, taking blurry photos, sending messages to Rose in the middle of the night, recounting every small advance as if it were the discovery of the century. Mrs. Lords observed everything with a mixture of surprise and approval. The boss she knew, cold and distant, had transformed into another person. And the house, that mansion that had been a silent mausoleum for so long, began to vibrate with sounds long unheard, laughter, music, the hustle and bustle of living people. But the medical team was confused. Dr. Patricia called an extraordinary meeting, bringing with her an internationally renowned neurologist who was visiting London. She needed a second opinion, because what she was seeing made no scientific sense. "We need to redo all the tests," she declared one Friday afternoon. "The girls are showing progress that completely contradicts the initial diagnosis. I want new MRIs, cognitive tests, complete neurological evaluations." Edward agreed immediately. "Do whatever is necessary. I want to understand what's happening." The tests were scheduled for the following week. It was 2 intense days at the Portland hospital, with Isabella and Gabriel undergoing a battery of tests. Edward stayed by their side the entire time, holding their little hands, humming to calm them when they got scared by the noisy equipment. Rose was also there because the girls were calmer in her presence. A week later, the results came back. Dr. Patricia called Edward for a conversation in her office, in a modern commercial building in Canary Wharf. When Edward entered the room, he saw that the doctor was not alone. There were 2 other specialists with her, all with serious expressions. "Dr. Edward, please have a seat," Dr. Patricia began, and by her tone of voice he already knew bombshell news was coming. "What is it? Are the girls okay? Have they gotten worse?" "No, they haven't gotten worse. On the contrary. The doctor took a deep breath, and for the first time since Edward had known her, she seemed insecure, almost vulnerable. "Dr. Edward, we made a mistake. A serious diagnostic error." Edward's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" One of the other doctors, a man in his 60s with thick-rimmed glasses, spoke up. "We reviewed all the old tests and compared them with the new ones. The girl's neurological images show completely normal brain structures, with no abnormalities that would justify the diagnosis of irreversible global developmental delay." But then, why were they like that? Why weren't they walking? Weren't they talking? Dr. Patricia clasped her hands on the table. "What your daughters suffered, Dr. Edward, was something that medical science often underestimates: deep emotional trauma with severe psychosomatic manifestation. In layman's terms, please, your daughters experienced trauma in utero and at birth, the loss of their mother, the extreme stress of a complicated delivery, the absence of primary emotional connection in their early years of life. All of this created a condition where their bodies simply gave up, shut down, not due to a neurological problem, but due to unprocessed emotional trauma." The third doctor, a younger woman specializing in child psychiatry, continued. "It's a rare condition, but documented in medical literature. Children can develop a kind of emotional paralysis so profound that it manifests physically. It's as if the nervous system enters an extreme preservation mode, shutting down functions not essential for immediate survival." Edward felt the world spin around him. "Are you saying that there was nothing physically wrong with them, that all this could have been avoided if they had received the right kind of intervention from the start?" "Yes," Dr. Patricia completed, her voice heavy with guilt. "And I take full responsibility for this error. We focused so much on the neurological aspects, on the tests, on the technical protocols, that we ignored the obvious. These children needed love, emotional presence, genuine human connection. The secret wasn't in medication or formal therapy," the psychiatrist added. "It was in what this woman, Rose, did. She offered unconditional presence, affection without expectations, sensory stimuli imbued with true emotion. She treated your daughters as people with souls, not as patients with symptoms." Edward remained silent for a long moment, processing. Anger, relief, guilt, and gratitude mixed in an impossible-to-organize whirlwind of emotions. "And now? What's the prognosis?" Dr. Patricia finally smiled, and it was a genuine smile. "Now, Dr. Edward, it's excellent. With the correct treatment, which, ironically, is less formal treatment and more loving presence, your daughters have every chance to develop normally. It may take months, perhaps a few years, but they will walk, they will talk, they will have a full life." Edward covered his face with his hands. He began to laugh and cry at the same time, a strange and liberating sound. 5 years, he said between sobs. 5 years wasted because of a wrong diagnosis and my cowardice." "They weren't wasted, doctor," the psychiatrist said gently. "You are here now. Your daughters are awakening now. The right time is always the moment we finally act." Edward left that office transformed. He had gone expecting bad news and came out with the confirmation of a miracle. His daughters were going to be fine. They were going to have a real chance at life. And he, finally, would be able to be the father he always should have been. When he arrived home, he went straight to the girls' room. Rose was there as always, telling a story about a butterfly that was afraid to fly. The girls were sitting on the rug, completely engrossed in the narrative. Edward stopped in the doorway, just observing the scene, his heart overflowing. Rose noticed his presence and looked up. She saw something different on his face, a light that hadn't been there before. "Did everything go well?" she asked. Edward nodded, unable to speak. He entered the room, knelt beside his daughters, and picked them both up. "Are you hearing this, my loves? You're going to be okay. Daddy will take care of you. I'll be here every day. I'll teach you to walk, to talk, to fly. I won't run away anymore." And it was at that moment that the true miracle happened. Gabrielle, who had always been the quieter of the two, looked directly at Edward. Her lips moved, her brow furrowed in concentration. And then, with a small but crystal-clear voice, she spoke her first word. "Daddy." Time stopped. Edward froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. What did you say, my love?" "Daddy?" Gabrielle repeated, this time more confidently, and smiled. She truly smiled, a huge smile that lit up her entire face. Edward broke down. He hugged the two girls tightly against his chest and cried as he had never cried in his life. They were tears of joy, of relief, of redemption. Rose cried along, her hands over her heart, witnessing the impossible becoming real. "Daddy." Now it was Isabella's turn to repeat, touching Edward's wet face with her tiny hands. "Daddy sad?" Edward laughed through his tears. "No, my love. Daddy isn't sad. Daddy is happy. Happier than he has ever been in his life." The following months were of complete transformation. Edward reduced his workload by half, hired a CEO to manage the daily operations of the company, and began to dedicate his mornings and afternoons to his daughters. He learned to change diapers, to spoon-feed them, to make airplane noises with the spoon. He learned that success is not measured in profits or professional achievements, but in children's laughter and tight hugs. Rose was no longer an employee. Edward had insisted on formalizing her position as a specialized caregiver for the girls, with a decent salary and all benefits. But more than that, she had become part of the family. She was Aunt Rose, the person who had saved those children when no one else believed in them. Edward also created something bigger. He founded a non-profit organization dedicated to children with emotional trauma and psychosomatic diagnoses. He named it the Marianne Novaes Institute, Healing Through Human Connection. The goal was to train healthcare professionals to recognize the signs of emotional trauma in children and to treat not only the body, but also the soul. Rose was hired as a consultant to teach sophisticated therapists what she knew intuitively, that sometimes the best medicine is simply true love. A year after that day, Rose first entered the mansion. The house was unrecognizable. The garden, once impeccable but dead, now had disheveled flowers that Isabella and Gabriel had helped plant. There were toys scattered across the living room, colorful drawings stuck to the refrigerator, the constant sound of life happening. The girls had progressed in ways that doctors considered extraordinary. Isabella was already walking confidently, running through the garden, speaking complete sentences. Gabriel was a little behind, but she advanced every day. She still had physical therapy 3 times a week, still needed extra support, but she was alive in a way that was impossible to imagine a year before. One Sunday afternoon, Edward organized a special lunch. He invited Rose and her mother, who had come from Yorkshire to visit, the medical team that now worked with a completely new approach, and some close friends he had distanced himself from during the years of grief. After lunch, while everyone chatted in the garden, Edward asked for attention. "I wanted to thank all of you, especially Rose, who saved my daughters when I couldn't, who saw in them what no one else saw, who proved that love is the most powerful medicine there is." Rose, always shy, blushed. "Oh, Dr. Edward, I just did what anyone should do." "No," he interrupted her. "You did what I should have done from the start, and for that I will be eternally grateful. You didn't just save the girls, Rose, you saved me too. You taught me that it's possible to start over, that it's never too late to be who you were always meant to be." At that moment, Isabella and Gabriel came running, stumbling on the grass, laughing. Isabella held a yellow flower she had picked. "Daddy, Daddy! Look how pretty!" Edward knelt and received the flower as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. "It truly is beautiful, my love. Just like you. Just like your sister." Gabriel hugged his leg. "Tell the bird story?" Now. Edward looked at Rose, who smiled and nodded. And there in the middle of the sunny garden, with friends and family around, Edward Novaes sat on the grass and began to tell the story of the little birds who learned to fly. His voice wasn't beautiful. He still made up half the story as he went, but it didn't matter, because he was there, present, alive, loving and being loved. And as he told the story, he looked up at the blue London sky and mentally whispered to Marianne, "I did it, my love. I learned to be a father. Our girls are well, and I know you're proud. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." The silence that had long dominated that mansion had finally been broken. In its place there was laughter, conversation, off-key songs, and the glorious noise of life happening in all its imperfection and beauty. The house was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home. A place where love had conquered grief, where hope had defeated despair, where a shattered family had found its way back to itself. And it all began with a simple woman from the heart of Yorkshire, who had entered that house to clean the floors and, unknowingly, had also cleaned the deepest wounds of an entire family, who had proven that the greatest secret of medicine, the greatest healing power that exists, is not in expensive medicines or sophisticated techniques, but in something we all carry within us: the ability to love unconditionally, to truly be present, to believe in people even when they no longer believe in themselves. And this love, this presence, this belief had made two little birds who had forgotten how to fly open their wings again and take flight. A flight still trembling, still uncertain, but a true flight. Towards life, towards the future, towards the happiness that everyone deserves, but few have the courage to seek.